Macca's Guides.
Hey guys, Macca here with an in-depth analysis about loading times on the Xbox One X. In my review of the console, I touched on it briefly, but wanted to get more data out there for you guys and talk a little bit about my experience with loading screens, loading times, and how that compared from the S to the X. During these tests, I tried to make everything as even as possible and ran tests multiple times to make sure they were producing the right numbers. Also, if you do these tests, you may find slightly different numbers, just letting you know. So the first test I wanted to run was to see what kind of an improvement I could expect on the X from the S, assuming they were both doing the exact same thing. What I did was I loaded Assassin's Creed on my S, and then I did it on my X. This was before any of the 4K patches were available, so they were loading the same content. I found that I went from a 60-second loading screen on the S to roughly 36 seconds on the X. And I found that this general pattern and this general formula and conversion was roughly the same for every game I tested, depending on a couple of different things. I found similar results for Forza Motorsport 7, and I even tried it on games like Sniper Ghost Warrior 3, GTA 5, and The Witcher 3, which are very intensive on single player, and found that the X cut down the load times by almost half, but not quite half. I also tested games like Destiny 2, where I was actually able to load into the world before some of my friends. However, I found that the amount that I was able to get in before them was somewhat limited by the online functionalities of that game. So just a quick recap, when loading the exact same content and doing it on the S versus the X, regardless of whether I used both of them on an internal or both of them on an external, I found that I would roughly cut down my loading screens, and for every minute of loading on the S, I would see approximately 30 to 40 seconds of loading on the X. Now, obviously the X is going to be faster at loading the exact same content as the S. That's a little bit of a no-brainer, but a lot of gamers will be playing games that are enhanced or they'll be in 4K, which means that the X will have to load more than the S would have to load in a lower resolution without the same assets. And this is where things get a little bit interesting because every game is going to have a little bit of a unique setup. I ran multiple games on the S, obviously in 1080p, then I did that same game on the X with 1080p super sampled and would run that game again in 4K on the X and found a wide variety of results really depending on the game because every game is going to be handling their enhancements slightly differently, and for a game like Super Lucky's Tale, I found that the super sampled and the 4K version took the same amount of time to load, and that was actually less than the 1080p version on the S. However, that is not a general rule. Now, using this exact same format for a game like Gears of War 4, I found that the X could load a super sampled version faster than the S could load its 1080p version. However, I also found that the X took longer to render that same image in 4K, meaning I could save time, but in this case, I could also lose time depending on which version I'm playing. I tried this test on more games like Forza Motorsport 7 and Halo 5 and found more or less mixed results. It really depended on what the game was doing with its enhancements and what was being loaded. Whether it was a lot of graphics or whether it was a lot of physics, it made a big difference. Next, I wanted to test the improvements of some of the X's features on backward compatible games. I expected to see less of a performance increase because obviously these games were intended for 360, which meant that the Xbox One was already able to load them much faster. And there's only so much more power you can add before there's just a limitation within the games themselves. I tried doing my test with Halo 3, but I found that the loading times in that game were wildly inconsistent, so I switched to Red Dead Redemption, where I found that the X was able to load the game a little bit faster than the S, although like I said previously, the difference is a little bit less. I actually found that the X version even looked quite a bit better. Then I wanted to test the difference between the Xbox One X's internal hard drive and some of the external hard drives that I have. Now, there's a big disclaimer here, and that disclaimer is that all external hard drives are going to work a little bit differently, and I found that other people had varying results with their tests, so just keep that in mind. For the external drives, I decided to test a 2TB Slim that is USB powered, as well as an 8TB hub that is wall powered. Now this one was a little bit tricky to do because once you load a game, even if you quit out of it, there's still stuff stored in the cache. So I tested it by doing a hard reset after every iteration, and then I tested them all one after another and found similar results. But essentially what I found for the games that I tested was that the internal X hard drive, as well as my 2TB Slim and my 8TB hub, would all load the same content at the same speed. I found that there were some slight variances on a cold boot of the console, but for the most part, the differences were negligible. And when testing this on the Xbox One S, the external hard drives were almost always faster than the internal hard drives for that console. Last but not least, I wanted to install a disk and find out which of the two processes is faster, installing a disk on the S or doing it on the X, and I had some pretty surprising results. Now, both of them took roughly 23 minutes, plus or minus 20 seconds, but I would consider this deviation to be within the margin of error, and I would say that essentially they are the same. Assuming you're installing off of a disk with no additional online updates or patches and there's nothing else happening on your console, you can imagine that you'll get roughly 1 GB per minute of install speed, and in my case, a 23 GB game took roughly 23 minutes. I found that this amount of time stayed the same whether I installed on my Xbox One X internal or on my external. It seems that the bottleneck here is going to be the same for the X and the S. Also, a fun fact, the Xbox One X did take an early lead in disk installation, but then they kind of evened out, and eventually by the end of the installation, the S ended up winning by a few seconds. So, what does all of this data mean? What conclusions can we draw from all of these tests? Well, we know for certain that the Xbox One X can load games faster than the S, and as long as they're loading the same thing, it will always be faster. Some of that benefit is lost in backward compatibility, but that's to be expected. Your loading times for your enhanced games can vary from game to game based on what those enhancements are and what the game is trying to do for you. I also tested the internal hard drive versus my externals and found no difference, so it can be assumed that for a majority of external hard drives, as long as they're USB 3.0 compatible, you can expect to get similar loading times. Additionally, we installed a disk and found that there was no benefit to installing disks on the X. A quick closing statement to everything I've said in this video is that a lot of this stuff can be changed, fixed, and updated through patches in the future. So maybe there will be an update that'll allow us to install games faster in some way. Maybe there will be an update to a game like Gears of War 4 to allow the 4K to load as fast as the super sampled. All of these numbers can potentially change. I'm just presenting you with the numbers that I found at my time of testing. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope the video was informational. If it was, I would appreciate if you dropped a like and maybe shared the video with a friend. This video may not look like it took a lot of time, but it actually did, and it was actually a decent amount of hard work. I'd appreciate if you could drop that like. Special thanks to the amazing people on Patreon for supporting the show, and hopefully I see you guys next time. Peace.